For Global Business Update, Michael Wilson joins us now from Cape Town, South Africa. Good morning.
Morning. Asia markets slightly up. The borders between Hong Kong and China have been opened, and so that's helped a lot of optimism as far as that region's concerned. However, has to be said that Chinese consumers not really heading back to the shops just yet. Jack Ma, the founder of Ant, now if you remember, there was going to be a massive flotation, $37 billion worth of flotation. That was actually pulled in November 2010 because apparently the Chinese authorities didn't like the fact that Jack Ma's company was dominating the tech sector. He's given up control more or less. He did have 50% of the voting rights, now has 6.2%. Will it get in the way of an eventual IPO of Ant? Not quite clear at the moment, but all this is part of his wishing to curry favour with the authorities, and all part of the China tech crackdown. China is also suspending any social media accounts which criticise its anti-COVID policy. The Communist Party doesn't brook any kind of criticism at all. That's affecting about 1,000 accounts at the moment. Meanwhile, mainland China is set to take away the market in terms of making things for iPhone production. Now, this is in contrast to what we were hearing last week when Apple was searching around India and Vietnam for alternative manufacturers. China is attempting to claw back some of the market there. I'll talk about Brazil, really. We did touch on it last week. I'll only mention it because I feel as though we should, and in as much as I'm not quite sure about what the economic problems about this, but Bolsonaro supporters who refused to believe that he actually lost the election, which Lula eventually won, they actually rioted yesterday. They set siege to Congress, the Supreme Court, and also the palace there. And there's sort of echoes of January 26, 2021 that happened on Capitol Hill in the United States. But I just thought I'd mention it because that's still quite a volatile place to think about investing in. As far as the US stock market is concerned, US futures inched higher. Now, on Friday, the jobs figures were actually quite robust. But the most important thing, I feel, was the wage inflation figures, which showed a gradual fall. And if that means that the Fed's getting on top of inflation, that's enough to cheer the markets. And that means that interest rates won't be rising at quite the rate. Well, that was an indication, at least, on Friday, that interest rates won't be rising quite as fast and as quickly as had been thought already. But who's to know? The Fed has its own voice on that. Elon Musk, now there is a class action from shareholders, which was going to be heard in San Francisco. He's finding, or he's saying, or his attorneys are saying, that there's a lot of local opposition to Elon Musk in San Francisco. He wants it all transferred to Texas. This is the shareholders who actually are saying that his original tweet, which is a long time ago now, talking about taking the company private. This is in 2018 at $420 a share. Did that affect the share price? Did that affect what investors were actually thinking? I did actually feel personally that it's not really the way to govern a company, tweeting what ought to be happening through regulatory authorities, but there we are. Goldman Sachs, now originally they were going to cut 3,900 jobs. They're thinking about now 3,200, but it's still an indictment of what's happening in the markets. They're cutting from their consumer-facing division. That's 6.5% of the 40,000 workforce internationally, and also a slimming down of their investment bank activities as well. So that says if a company like Goldman Sachs is slimming down, it says a lot for the way the economy is actually going. And Kevin McCarthy, again, this is a US political thing, but the Speaker of the House is an important job. Apart from the Vice President, he's next in line to the ear of the President, and so therefore everything going through the House has to really go through him and then to the President. And of course, as you know, there are lots of different kind of things taking place within the United States at the moment. And it may well be that this because rebel Republicans could now halt any kind of legislation in the United States, it's all on a bit of a knife edge there as far as pushing through, Joe Biden pushing through more legislation towards the end of his term. I have the first figures for you for what the UK strikes probably are costing the authority. This comes from Panmure Gordon, which is a well-known and well-regarded stockbroker in the City of London. 0.25% of GDP, apparently, and a lot of that took place in December last year and coming into January this year. 1.6 billion of that, and the National Health Service itself backlog there, causing 200 million. Causing the economy to fail by £200 million. Whether or not those you can actually calculate these figures, who knows? But those, at least I thought I'd share those with you from Panmure Gordon. UK Shell is going to pay the first tax in 5 years. It says it's going to take a hit of 1.6 billion on its shares, on its profits of $9.5 billion dollars. Earlier this year, from July to September, that was a record, and the government is been clamping down on its government's energy profits levy, and that is part of this. And as far as the UK is concerned, foreign investors are turning away. Could be a bit to do with the fact that since in a year we've had 3 prime ministers, the UK's had 3 prime ministers, 4 chancellors, and 3 business secretaries. But 31% of those surveyed by something called Made UK actually are saying that the UK is not competitive compared with its European neighbours. And finally, oil is due for a rebound. I said this on Friday. It hasn't happened yet, but we balance against that China re-emergence possibly, and also a global recession, which the IMF forecast last week. That is the global view this morning.
Right. So what is really happening? With this strike thing, it's as if the UK economy is in toast as we speak today, because with debt of over 2 trillion, interest rate on those debt about 6.1 billion, although it increased recently when Liz Truss had the shenanigans she had on the market. And as that is going on, then you are hemorrhaging as regards GDP because of the strikes, 0.25% out on the GDP. Then the economy is heating up. So what is really happening? What is happening? I think there's a loss of leadership somewhere. Even Rishi Sunak, I don't know what's going on.
He came out with his 5-point plan, didn't he, Rishi Sunak, last week, and we talked about it then. And there wasn't a lot in there that was new. I mean, inflation will come down because that's just a calculation. Doesn't mean to say the cost of living won't hurt, and also energy costs as well coming down too. Who's to say what's going to happen in 2023? I think the nearest we can get to is the IMF's forecast of a recession, and certainly I think will be a relatively shallow recession in the UK. I think it's going to be very tough indeed. It's a question really of whether or not overseas companies keep faith in the issuance of UK gilts. If they do, then that'll carry the UK through. But if they don't, I think that what has to happen is that Rishi Sunak has to be seen to be getting around a table with the strikers at the moment, and the indications are that will happen at some kind of stage. So there's a slight softening there, but still, what he's saying is that whatever the unions want has to be responsible and has to fit in with what the economy can actually afford. So I think all those kind of outward signs are probably set reasonably fair, but let's not, as you quite rightly say, the problems of the economy are huge and lasting, and will last. It's going to be a very, very tough 2023. No question about that.
Right, moving away, since we've talked about the UK, let's talk about China. Reports coming in from China, particularly following removal of COVID restrictions, very worrying. Now you're talking about them clamping down on social media platforms that criticize and perhaps are able to paint a true picture of what's going on in China. WHO and World Health Organization warned a few days back that they are underreporting deaths. They've seen high-profile deaths, including the opera singer in December, Chulan Lan. The concerns around China, and yesterday they removed further restrictions on travel. What's the impact of this? Definitely worrying for the world at large.
I mean, the problem is, it's, as usual, it's a very mixed picture. I mean, what you know? So I'm not so sure that facts about the economy are going to come from social media. I think what's being reflected in social media is the anger of people who were open-endedly just being confined to their apartments or to their houses, wherever it may be in China, as a result of the anti-COVID measures. And I think the government came in for a lot of criticism about that. Certainly, some of the industrial upheaval at, for example, Foxconn, which we noted as well, was all part of that. So it's a very difficult gentle tread back into what's happening post-pandemic. The Communist Party doesn't brook any criticism. I think it's a reasonable sign that borders have been opened. I think what the Chinese probably will have to do, and I suspect we'll get a very mixed picture over the coming weeks, is learn how to live with COVID and boost the herd immunity. If that happens within China, then I think that's probably quite good news for the economy. But as far as I can see, and I share your views on it completely, it seems a long way off right now.
Well, still on China, I mean, Asia-Pacific markets traded higher yesterday with the barrier between Hong Kong and China being removed, marking the end of the zero-COVID policy. But I've seen comments saying that, look, China's reopening will have very terrible side effects for the rest of the world, particularly countries that depend on commodities. Already inflation has hit a record high in Europe, and the fear is that if Brent crude, for example, goes up to $100, if there is further pressure on prices of other commodities with increased demand from China, that other countries, particularly in the West, would have to further tighten monetary policy. So what's the connection, really, in practical terms? And then as for Jack Ma, well, Jack Ma saying that he's relinquishing control at Ant Financials. That's an indication, of course, that the Chinese authorities are getting away, with their insistence that, look, these big tech companies, they don't want the monopoly of one man and all of that. But what happens to the Ant Group hereafter? You recall that in November 2020, the Ant Group had to suspend its IPO of $37 billion. Now, would this provide an opportunity for them to go back to that issuance of that IPO? And if they must, what are the hurdles, likely hurdles?
I think Ant is an opportunity for somebody to actually come forward. I suspect the state of China will probably have the majority of holdings as it does at the moment. He's certainly stepped down from his 50% to 6.2% of control in the company. And I think what he's doing is actually acknowledging the fact that, it seems a long time ago now, doesn't it, when he gave that speech, but it was certainly something which angered the authorities. And this is something which people are complaining about. Again, it's a very mixed picture, what's happening in the United States. Yeah, sure, the Asia shares went up. Again, I'm reading what the market's telling me, which is because of that opening of borders between Hong Kong and China. I mean, it could be a lot also to do with the jobs figures in the United States, which were quite robust. But the fact that inflation was coming down says a lot about global interest rates and so on. Now, you can play with the figures any way you like, and you can play the inflation game and so on. I think probably long term, it's healthy that China opens up, because it still has to find a market for its goods. And there's no point in drawing in commodities if it hasn't got a market for its goods. So I think things will probably go out and down. I think it's a bit too volatile to say anything specific about what's going on there. But I think you're absolutely right. They concentrate on the commodity markets, but they're not necessarily going to add to inflation, because those commodities have to be made into things that people want to buy. And I'm not quite sure that they want to do that at the moment. So I would say that it's a little early to start making prognostications about the way inflation is actually going in the rest of the world.
Well, thank you very much, Michael Wilson. Thank you very much indeed. Now we move on. Education has been in the headlines in Nigeria, with presidential candidate of the All Progressives Congress, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, promising student loans if elected, and the Academic Staff Union of Universities president calling for an increase in education tax from 2.5% to 10%. Arise business correspondent Rotus Odiri investigated the viability of both. Here is his report.
Education is critical to every economy around the world, none more so than Nigeria. One of the biggest issues facing education in Africa's largest economy is funding it. Recently, there have been a couple solutions that have been put forward: student loans and raising taxes. Nigeria now has about 20 million out-of-school children, according to the latest global data on out-of-school children by UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. Here is Nigeria's Vice President, Professor Yemi Osibanjo, on Nigeria's Sustainable Development Goals, where he emphasized healthcare and education.
The Office of the Senior Special Assistant to the President on SDGs, in close collaboration with relevant ministries, embarked on an independent evaluation of two priority SDGs, SDG 3 on quality health and well-being for all, and SDG 4 on qualitative and inclusive education and lifelong learning for all. Significantly, the report noted that education financing is much lower than in other African countries, and that transparency around education budgeting and spending needs to improve.
The Secretary General was very...
Matthias Schmali, United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator in Nigeria, has expressed his concerns about Nigeria's ability to fund education. He said, in relation to the SDG 4 on quality education, it is, for example, concerning to note that Nigeria is unlikely to achieve the global agenda for universal, inclusive, and equitable basic education for all school-age children by 2030 if the current very low public investment in the education sector remains the same. He also said in the 2022 budget, there was an increase to 7% on education, but the evaluation says it will need to increase to 20% with clear accountabilities on delivery. Nigeria's 2023 budget allocation for education is 1.79 trillion naira, 8.2% of the total budget, which is an improvement from 2022, but still under the 20% threshold advised by the United Nations. One of the solutions being put forward is coming from the presidential candidate of the All Progressive Congress, Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu. He is suggesting student loans.
We will give you.
Back in 2015, while campaigning for Muhammadu Buhari, Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu said the APC would provide student loans.
We will give you student loan. Our program, 4 years will be 4 years. You will not extend before 4 years to graduate in a university.
7 years later, in 2022, Festus Keyamo, Minister of State for Labor and Employment and also the spokesman for the Tinubu presidential campaign, said low revenue was the reason the promise wasn't kept, but the promise is still alive.
So there was a problem of revenue, but the dream remained alive. The dream to fulfill these promises are still alive today as we begin to ramp up our revenues.
The APC presidential candidate has repeated this campaign promise in 2022 and 2023, but is yet to speak to any local media to explain how student loans in Nigeria will be funded under his plan.
We will establish student loan. 4 years course, must be 4 years course. The variables, we take care of the variables. Interest rate, when does it start? When do you start to pay? When do you start to be employed? What aspect of it is to be written off during NYC? Or when does it? We answer those questions. They are questions. They have answers. Conceptually, the student loan, no one should be left behind. There will be student loan. If you cannot finance yourself, we give you a loan. You complete the education. When you get the work, only when you start working and with the capacity to pay, then you start to pay.
So the question is, are student loans in Nigeria viable? Well, we went looking for answers.
The student loan in Nigeria is really not viable. It's not implementable. I feel like putting the children in bondage. a country as rich as America introduced this bank loan, and somewhere along the line, because the students, those who pass through, are suffering in payment, the present president, who is a Democrat, decided to write off most of this loan, and is still doing so because it's having an adverse effect on the citizen. So if in a country like America, where people get job when you are through, you could have, if you don't have a job, you could have the country assist you, the loan did not work. Is it in Nigeria where you have 133 million Nigerians being under poverty line that the people go to take loan and pay, where unemployment is as high as 30-40%? Is that where they will pay?
The first thing a lender worries about is the source of repayment of the loan. You are lending students money to get an education without knowing whether they will get a job or what will happen or not. Therefore, I don't think lending money to students works anywhere. I mean, in the US, it's a problem. There's no point lending and giving debt forgiveness. I believe a much more viable option is to give scholarships and grants and bursaries so that education is a right. So free and compulsory and quality education is a right. And therefore, my view is that the monies that will be saved from subsidies should be deployed almost totally, fully towards funding education.
I have my significant doubt as to whether student loan will be a viable proposition in Nigeria as of today, essentially because of a number of factors. The first one is around data and identity management. So we don't have a unique way, even though we have the NIN, but it hasn't been well established and entrenched into the system such that it will be difficult for you to even track who got the loan, are they now employed, how much they need to pay back. Also think about the fact that in terms of the science we're looking at, we have around 2 million undergraduates in all the Nigerian universities. As of today, about 300,000 postgraduate students. If you estimate that the amount of money they would need, you're easily talking about 1 trillion a year, at least for the first few years before students start hopefully repaying back. So that's going to be a big one, because if governments could afford about 1 trillion, why have they not been funding the demands of ASU?
Another solution that's being put forward is to raise taxes for education. And this is being preferred by the president of the Academic Staff Union of Universities. What he has suggested is to raise the education tax from 2.5% to 10%. Now, for context, the Finance Bill 2022 currently calls for that tax to be raised from 2.5% to 3%. We asked the president of ASU why, and we also got reactions to his proposal.
Well, that idea actually came from me as a person. And my idea is this. As at present, in 1992, when we had an agreement with government, and government said there's no money to fund it, like they are saying now, they now challenge us to look for other means we can use to pay this, we can use to fund this your agreement. That was the origin of TED Fund. That was the idea is from ASU. So this time around, the government also saying that there is no money to fund education. We can only give 5.9% budget to education. I guess 16%. The country will do, and so all sort of thing. And we are suggesting, and they are not suggesting, we should not introduce tuition fee for the children of a man or a family that earn 30,000 a month, less than a bag of rice. How will these 130 million people be able to pay fee for their children and be in school? My own idea, instead of trying to tax these 133 million people who are already on that poverty line, why don't you take 10% of the profit of the big men? Just 10% of the profit, not the capital, of the big men, the big companies. Why not take 10%? Instead of punishing 133 million who are on that poverty, why not take 30% and inject into the education system, so that all the children can have access to good education, create jobs, and you have a better country, free country, a country where we will not need to spend so much of our resources on insecurity. So that is my idea.
I think, again, that's another knee-jerk reaction, with all due respect for ASU. what has been done with the 2.5%? What have we achieved so far with the Education Tertiary Fund and all of that? We should now look at how effective our tax collection and utilization of tax proceeds has been in terms of its impact on the people.
Yeah, I completely disagree with ASU on that proposal to increase tertiary education tax to 10%. I can tell you that as of today, we have it at 2.5%, and that was an increase just about 1 year ago. And based on the 2022 finance bill, there's already another proposal to make it 3%. For those of us who are involved in tax matter, I can tell you authoritatively that this education tax, 1 basis point of education tax rate is equivalent to 2 basis points of companies' income tax rate, because it's calculated on a much larger base than the corporate income tax. So what that means effectively is that if you take the corporate income tax of 30%, take the tertiary education tax, multiply it by 2, that gives you 5%. You have NITDA, information technology tax, you have the police tax, you have the science and engineering tax. By the time you stack it all together, in addition to the 10% withholding tax that companies pay when they distribute their profits, you would easily find that the effective tax rate on corporates in Nigeria is well over 40%. This is one of the top 10 highest in the world. For a country where you need a lot of investments to attract, it's much higher than the average for even the OECD and for Africa. So the problem that we have with the educational sector is not to keep increasing the burden on the private sector to fund them. Fundamental question should be, over the past 10 years alone, education tax has contributed over 2 trillion naira to that sector. Who is explaining how that money has been spent?
So what about students? What do they think about taking loans to fund their studies and raising taxes to fund universities in Nigeria?
On the matter of student loan, I will not take at the moment.
Why not?
Because I can comfortably afford the fees at the moment. But if there's a situation whereby there's an increase over the years, I might be forced to.
For a start, I wouldn't take a loan because I don't need it, because it's being funded by my parents. But we have students that have difficult terrain on campus and all of that. So, and if I'm in that shoe, I don't think I would want to take a loan. I want to do something else, maybe borrow money from a friend and pay back, because we know that all these loan companies, they ask for too much. They will tell you a term and condition. At the end of the day, they will not abide by them. They will tarnish your image in society and send you messages, send your relative messages and all of that. So I wouldn't want to take a loan. I want to prefer another option.
I love what ASU is doing. ASU is a formidable prayer group on the government. If you look at our education system, most of the development we are seeing is because ASU is not keeping quiet. But on the issue of increasing educational tax from 2.5% to 10%, I think they need to go back to the drawing board and put more pressure on government to see where there are possible leakages in the existing 2.5 educational tax and see whether it is even being judiciously used.
Nigeria urgently needs to attend to her education sector, and it is hoped that the conversations being held today can quickly become effective policies of tomorrow for the purpose of our youth. Roti Sodiri, Arise News.
A brilliant report there by Roti Sodiri on student loans.